My name is Lisa Kranz Meuser. I am today 44 years of age. Today is April 20th, 2008. I am seated in Sacramento, California with my brother Dave and my mother Virginia.
And I'm Dave Kranz. I am 52, will be 53 in a couple weeks. I am here on April 20th, 2008 in Sacramento with my sister and my mother.
And I'm Virginia McConnaha Kranz. I have recently had my 80th birthday. It's April the 20th, 2008, and I'm with my children, Dave and Lisa, in Sacramento, California.
All right, Ma, let's start by talking about your early years. Tell us about where you were born and where you grew up.
I was born in the country in Illinois on what was known then as the Warrington Road. In February in a snowy night, and I lived in that. My family lived there for about until I was 3 or 4 years old, and then we moved up the road a piece, as we say, and onto the Embarrass Road, and I grew up there.
What part of Illinois was that?
Edgar County.
So that's southeastern Illinois?
It's eastern Illinois, in the middle of the state. About halfway between Chicago and St. Louis, they always said.
And so in that area, you would have been born at home.
I was born at home.
Yeah. What's your earliest memory?
I do remember the house where I was born, and my older sisters were born there too. And I remember they were always, I remember having I stuck my head through the banister in the staircase, and to watch some men who were putting wallpaper on the walls, and my head was stuck. And I remember that they rescued me, and my mom was,
How did they rescue you?
Well, I think they took one of the spirals of the banister out and got me out of there. But that's about the only memory I have of that house. And then I remember the moving day, because I was taken to a neighbor's house and stayed with her during the day, an older lady. And she had chimes in a doorway of the house. And when she'd walk through the doorway, she had a little white hair with a little knot on the top of her head. And she'd walk through that doorway and those chimes would play. And I'd never heard chimes before, so that impressed me too.
Why did you move?
Well, I think that the farm was going to be sold, part of the farm that we lived on. So my dad decided to move, and those were hard days. That was in the middle of the Depression, 31 or 32. Yeah. And then they lived there for wouldn't know how many years, until they retired and moved into town. So the town being Redmond.
And so, did your father ever own any of the land he farmed, or was he a tenant farmer primarily?
Well, he farmed land that wasn't his, but he also he had 40 or so acres that was his own, that he farmed too, that adjoined the farm where we lived.
And so what was he growing?
Corn and beans mostly at that time. And he had cattle. He had pasture land, and he raised some cattle and hogs for our own benefit, I guess. But he raised cattle to sell too.
So when you say beans, that's soybeans?
Soybeans.
Yeah, okay. What, do you have any memory of the Depression? Were you aware that it was tough times?
I knew, yes, I do. And people used to come. Well, there was a railroad track near the house, and people used to come, and my mom would feed people who hobos who were traveling on the railroad, and they didn't ever come in the house, but she'd fix them a plate of food, and they'd sit out on the porch, and I think they told everybody else.
So what was it like growing up?
Well, I had 3 older sisters, and they made it interesting for me, if nothing else. But then they were quite a bit older than I was, and then after they left home, it was lonely for me in a lot of ways, because we weren't near, Well, we were only a mile and a half from town, so it wasn't that bad. But it was different than if you'd had lots of neighbors close by. But we were always in touch, and we always knew what was happening, and we always had a telephone, and lots of people didn't. We always had a radio, lots of people didn't. So we were, we were okay, and we raised our food primarily, so we had plenty. But a lot of people didn't have plenty.
So what chores did you have to do on the farm?
Well, I used to shell corn for the livestock. Then we had a corn sheller, and that was a dirty, dusty job. And I used to pump the water. There was a big water tank, and so there had to be water in the water tank all the time. So those are two things that I remember, two tiresome things that I remember. I never learned to milk because my mom told me not to ever learn to milk.
So she did that.
Because she had to do it sometimes when Dad was in the field, long hours in the summertime.
Did you ever have to help cook meals?
No, I never did. That's where older sisters came in handy.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of ways.
Tell us about Deba and Deba.
They were my imaginary playmates.
Was that after your sisters moved?
No,
moved
I think
away?
that was probably before. They were always busy with their own chores and their own lives too. And so I created them and talked to them, and everybody worried about me a lot.
What kinds of things would you do?
You mean for my own entertainment?
Yeah.
Oh, there were anything with wheels I liked. I roller skate. I learned to roller skate when I was very young, and what little concrete there was around, I roller skated, and then I had a good friend who lived a few, I started to say miles, but it wasn't that far. But we used to walk to each other's houses, and she played the piano, so she'd play the piano, and we'd sing, and it was a good life. I've had a very good life. I don't have many complaints.
What was your friend's name?
Ruth Conley.
Mm-hmm. And what happened to her?
She's still. I see her whenever I go back to Illinois. She's still living on a farm in Illinois. She's had a good life too.
Yeah, interesting. What's your best memory of childhood?
My best memory. Well, I think it's probably when all the family would come for Sunday dinners. A lot of times all of my mom's family would be there, or we'd be somewhere together. And I had a lot of girl cousins, and we had really good times together.
So how many people would that be?
Well, my grandparents, my mother's parents, had 21 grandchildren, and 18 of them were female. So I was right at the end of the line.
Wow.
So, we did, we played games, and we had a good time together.
What kind of games would you play?
Oh, tag and hide and seek, and the usual things. And I had one girl cousin who was just about my age, and when we gather at my grandparents' home, they had an old brass bed, and one of the knobs at the end of the bedstead was loose and came out, and we used to leave notes to each other in that place. And we wouldn't always be there at the same time, but we'd leave notes, and we'd hurry to that and take the post off the bed, look to see if there was a note in there for us.
It was a different kind of post office then.
Yeah.
So what kind of notes? I mean, what would you say to each other?
Inane. They didn't mean anything, but just something to know that, to be in touch with each other.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. What would be a good day for you when you were a kid growing up on the farm? What would be, if you had an ideal day, what kind of day would it be?
Well, probably a lot of it would have to do with what kind of meals we had. But the weather always played a lot in what happened too, So I don't ever remember that there was any, or to go somewhere. To go somewhere was a big deal. So we always looked forward to going to town. And for a few years, my dad would go to to the livestock sales on Thursdays sometimes, and Mom and I would go to the movies, and the matinees, and see Shirley Temple and that kind of thing. So that was a big happening.
So where would you go?
To Paris.
To Paris, Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how long would it take you to get there?
Oh, it was probably 15 miles, something like that.
So your mom drove?
No, my mom didn't
I
drive.
was going to say.
No, she never did learn to drive. My dad would drive us there.
Oh, okay.
Leave
So you
us
weren't
off
sneaking off to the movies then?
No.
You just probably walk from the sale to the movies? Is that what you did? Or?
Well, I think he dropped
Oh, he
us
dropped
off
us
and
off,
picked us
yeah.
up. Yeah. And then we'd go have ice cream after. Meadow Gold ice cream parlor.
So when did you learn to drive?
Oh, I learned to drive long before I was old enough to drive. Because my dad needed me to drive. So, and I'm sure you've heard that I used to sit on a syrup can with a pillow on top of it so I could see out, and because I'd run errands for him and take his lunch to the field to him sometimes, and take him water jugs, and sometimes even go into town the back way, stay off off of the main road, and get him a piece of equipment, farm equipment or whatever, because he didn't have a hired man a lot of the time during the war, because they weren't available. So I had to kind of fill in a little bit, and especially my older sisters weren't at home anymore.
And so how old would you have been then?
Oh, probably 13. Probably about the time I started high school.
Mm-hmm.
Which reminds me that I was in high school the 4 years of World War II, from 1941 to 1945, which was...
So tell me about being in high school. During that time, you were in a small high school, right? It was...
Yes, and it shrunk a lot during those 4 years, too, because a lot of people left, some by choice, mostly by choice, I suppose, but a lot because there were jobs other places, and just for patriotic reasons too. There weren't any men around.
So this was Redmond High School.
Redmond High School.
And what was your mascot? Your school
Indian.
mascot? You're
Redmond
the
Indians.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how many? When we say it was a small high school, how many students were in the high school?
I don't really know, but I just know that from my time that my older sisters were there were lots bigger classes and more students at that time than by the time that I was there in those war years. And then in the early 50s, the school closed because there was not enough attendance, and they combined several of the high schools from the small towns and built a new school.
Well, how many were in your graduating class?
8.
Were you the valedictorian?
I was, yes.
Do you still have your speech?
No, I don't think so.
So what was it like to be in high school during World War II?
Well, to compare it to other times, there was, of course, gas rationing. You couldn't buy tires. There was all kinds of rationing, food rationing. You couldn't go get in a car and go places like, for instance, my sisters had before me. They'd gone. They always could go and drive the car and go wherever they wanted to go, within reason. My father was pretty lenient about things like that, and that was not available then.
So where were your sisters during that time?
Well, various places. My oldest sister and her husband lived on a farm not too far from us, and they did go some, and I did get to go with them. And my sister Edie, her husband was in the service, and then for a while she came home and was at home during those times too, but then eventually she went to be with him. and then my sister Mac came to California with Edie when she came, so she could get a lot better job here than she could back in Illinois. So.
And then your father continued to farm.
Mm-hmm.
He would have been, what, in his 50s at that
Well,
time?
or approaching 60, I suppose. Because, well, he was 40 when I was born, so he would have been 57 or so. I was out of high school at 17.
Do you remember the start of the war?
Oh, yes, very well. Because my sister Edie and her husband were at the house that Sunday afternoon. We were all having dinner, I believe, when I think the phone rang and somebody called us to tell us, and then we turned on the radio and heard about it. And they were saying to each other, well, that's that. For every man who heard the news, I think, was thinking, well, that means he's going into the service. And he did, So,
Most did, but
yeah.
but
Jim
Jim
didn't, no.
had bad eyes, or?
Well, he was on the farm, so I suppose he got a deferment for being on the farm.
Farmers were exempt because that was considered part of the national defense.
It was. They could be, at least for a while. A lot of them went anyway, but he had his own farm there, so he didn't go into the service.
With the rationing during the war, was your father able to get the gasoline he needed? And
he
everything?
did. He had a special permit, being a farmer, that for the farm equipment and also for the vehicles. But yes, he was. But you didn't waste it. I mean, it was. They figured it out pretty well, I think.
Mm-hmm. So, as you were coming towards the end of high school, what were you thinking you were going to do?
Well, there were a few things that I investigated, and I won a scholarship because to Eastern Illinois Teachers College in Charleston, but I didn't want to be a teacher. So I remember going to Terre Haute to the TWA office because they were just beginning, I think, coast-to-coast flights, and they had stewardesses and flight attendants. And I was really interested in doing that. I thought, boy, what a great life that would be. And I went and investigated and got literature, excuse me, and learned that you had to be a registered nurse at that time to be a flight attendant. So there that went. That was the end of that career because I didn't have any more desire to be a nurse than I had to be a teacher, and that was about all that was available at that time.
So what did you do?
Well, so there was a job available to me before I graduated that I didn't even know about. But there was actually a registered nurse who worked in a hospital in Urbana, Illinois, and she had a sister who lived in Redmond who knew my parents, and her sister came and asked my parents if I'd be interested in going there to work as a secretary at the hospital. They needed a secretary and a bookkeeper, and this was the Champaign County Hospital.
And how far was that from home?
Oh, 60 miles probably, something like that. And so my dad had said, oh yes, she would be, of course. And so I had a job before I was ever out of high school. And I had thought then that maybe I'd go there for the summer and then do something else in the fall. Because the University of Illinois was there, and I was still, pondering the Eastern Illinois College too. And Ethel, my sister Ethel, had told me she'd help me if I wanted to go there. But by the time the fall came, the war was over. Part of it was over already, and then so I never did.
So what'd you do on that job? What was a day like?
Pretty boring most of the time, actually. I did keep I did have to keep a set of books, and I did a lot of phone work and that kind of thing. But it was not a very particularly exciting or.
So you worked in administration at the
It
hospital?
was a small hospital, and there wasn't. I don't remember it that well, actually, to tell you.
Where did you live?
I lived there. I lived on the hospital grounds. There was a nurse's home, and I had a room there. So I had a salary. What my dad thought was so great about it was that I had a salary, and I had my room and board. Well, there was a dining room in the hospital. My meals were furnished to me, so he thought I could save every dime that I made.
And what was your salary?
$75 a month in room and board. I never forgot that. It did go up a little bit as I proved to be satisfactory.
How long did you work there?
I worked there until I was married. And afterwards, a while after I was married.
So how did you meet this person who became our father?
Well, he was a student at the University of Illinois, and he sort of was in and out of school a lot. He had a few problems managing to stay in school. And he always had a part-time job at one of the local newspapers. And he worked on the Daily Illini, became sports editor of the Daily Illini. And so he always would have work, you know. And one of his jobs was he called the hospital for vital statistics every day for births and deaths, and so I started talking to him on the telephone. And he made me laugh. He just said the funniest things. So that was how it got started.
Can you remember some of the things he said?
Oh, he'd tell me well, we were always trying to describe each other to each other, so we'd have some kind of a clue. And he said he had red hair, and I don't remember, but he, well, your father, you can imagine some of the things he would say. And then at Christmas, that Christmas, which I think must have been the Christmas of 1947, he came actually with a box of candy to give to some of the people that he spoke to on the phone. And I'd already gone home for Christmas, so I missed him. And that was a big disappointment to me, and I'm sure to him too. And then in January, there had been a murder of a bartender who worked in a roadhouse up between Urbana and Rantoul. And it was a big story, and there was going to be an inquest into this man's death. Well, they didn't know if he'd been murdered or what the cause of death was, or there wouldn't have been an inquest. So he invited me to go to the inquest with him. He was covering the inquest and invited me to go, which was, pretty, I wanted to go. And so I agreed to meet him at a place called Bunny's, a tavern called Bunny's in Urbana. And I didn't really want to go by myself to meet him since I didn't know him. So, and he was, describing what, I'm sure gave me a terrible description of what he was going to look like and everything. And I ended, the gist of the story is that I took a girlfriend with me. And she actually had seen him when he'd come to deliver the candy. So that was one thing. And for my own protection, too, I took a girlfriend. And I just said he never let me forget that, that I had to bring, on our first date, I had to bring a girlfriend with me. So.
Well, so your first date was to an inquest,
Yes.
and you met at a bar to go to the inquest.
That's right. That's right.
So that was the first time you saw each other.
That's right. That's right.
So what was your first impression?
And I remember, well, it was, I liked him a lot. And then I know that was in January because my birthday was in February, and he invited me to go to dinner for my birthday, and he took me to the Urbana Lincoln Hotel, which was the swankiest place in town, and we had dinner. So he impressed me a lot. He was a big old Chicago boy, that taking this little country girl out was really something.
So was that your first actual date then?
Yes. If you don't count the inquest.
I think we have to count the inquest. Did you ever go to any other inquests with him?
I don't ever recall that I did. I think he got into sports writing after that.
Okay. Well, then okay, so when did you start to think maybe this was going to be the person you'd marry?
Oh, I was swept off my feet. I knew right away. But it wasn't so easy to convince him, maybe. But I did know, because after I'd gone to dinner, when I went back to visit my family, I told my mother that I thought I wanted to marry him if I ever had the opportunity.
What'd she say?
Well, she was happy for me, She'd been wondering what was ever going to become of me, I guess.
So how did your parents meet him then? How did that happen?
Well, I think that my sister Mac and her husband came and picked us up, maybe, because we didn't have a car. Dick didn't have a car, and took us to a family gathering of some kind. Maybe the Hanner reunion, which was a big thing. But I remember better meeting his parents than I do his introduction to my parents.
Yeah. What was that like?
Well, it was intimidating for me. And I took the train to Chicago, and he met me at the 63rd Street station, and it was New Year's Eve, and he had a party planned for me to meet his friends in Chicago, and we went out and went to a nightclub, and he had his father's car, 38 Buick, and we went. When we came out, there was a blizzard, and it was snowing, and the weather was really bad, and so we just got everybody home and went back to his parents' home, and they were worried, because the weather had gotten so bad in that length of time. So that was my first.
So that's how you met the first time?
Mm-hmm.
After midnight or whatever on New Year's
Well,
Eve?
I'd been to the house before. He'd taken me to the house before, so.
Well, you said it was intimidating.
Well, it always is, I think, when you meet somebody's parents and you want to make an impression, and he talked a lot about his mother too, and
He scared you?
Yeah.
What scared you about it?
Well, I knew that she had he thought she had a quick temper anyway, and he could joke around with her, but not a lot of people could. So, and I knew that she didn't, she wasn't fond of the Irish, but other than that, but she was always very sweet to me, and I didn't have any problems at all, especially after I had children.
And so how was it decided that you were going to be married? How did he propose?
Well, I think it was more assumed than anything else. Well, you want me to tell the story about how I was caught out with somebody else? Is that what you want?
Tell me any story you want to tell me.
Well, I had been home for a weekend back visiting my parents, and there was a fellow that I knew who was just a friend of mine, and sometimes he would bring me back to Champaign-Urbana in a car, because I didn't have a car. And we'd go to a movie or something, and so that happened that weekend, and I mean, Dick had never said anything about, going steady, which was the thing to do then. Before you were engaged, you'd go steady, and so my friend Tom brought me back, and we went to the movie and came out of the movie, and we ran into Jean Shalit, who was Dick's roommate at that time. So I thought, well, I'm a goner now, and sure enough, he went right home and told Dick he'd seen me with another fella, and it didn't mean anything, but anyway, then decided that he called and said, "Are you my girl or are you not?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to be." So that took care of that, and I don't think I ever went out with anybody again. I might have gotten a car ride with somebody again. I don't know.
So then how did you decide to get married, or how did he propose? Or?
Well, it was, and I'm not sure the timing of when this was, but he was back in school full time by that time, and he was working weekend jobs and stuff, but we didn't have any money. And so he told his parents that he wanted to, that we wanted to get married. And his dad agreed to continue paying his tuition and everything, and so then that's when we decided. And he got the rings that cost, I told you, through Bill Michael, who worked for a jewelry company. Gave me the rings in a subway, a coffee shop under the subway in Chicago.
That's romantic.
Isn't that romantic?
Yeah, I like it.
And so then, at what point did you decide you were going to become a Catholic in order to get married in the church?
Well,
Tell me
that
about
time,
that process.
I guess. Yeah. Well, you couldn't get married in a church, unless you were actually were Catholic at that time. And I wanted to be married in a church. I didn't care particularly what kind of a church it was, but I did want to be married in church. So I took instructions and we got married in the Catholic Church, which I'm sure pleased his parents a lot. And I don't think it made that much difference to my parents. They were, my mom went to the Christian church and my dad had at one time, but they were not regular churchgoers or anything. And so it didn't really make that much difference to them.
How long did that process take?
A few weeks. I think it was the summer before our wedding in September. Yes.
So how long were you engaged then before you got married?
I think that was in May, and then we got married in September, I believe.
So what was your wedding day like?
It was good. The wedding was at 11 o'clock in the morning because my family had to come from Redmond and his family came from Chicago. And then we had a reception in the afternoon, and it was, it was nice. It was good. It was small, but it was nice.
So you were married in Champaign?
St. Patrick's Church in Urbana. I think you've been there.
I have.
Yeah.
Although we should make clear, she wasn't there at the time.
No, not at the time. Took a long time for her to be there.
So then what did you do for your honeymoon?
We went, Grandpa Kranz gave us his car, which was still the 38 Buick, and we went on a motor trip through the South, and we were in New Orleans. First time I'd ever seen New Orleans, and sort of fell in love with it. I always really liked New Orleans, but I was shocked. Like I said, I've told you before, it's the first time I'd ever seen segregation, and so that really was a shock to me.
Was that your first time seeing water too, a water body?
Yes, except for the Great Lakes. I'd seen the Great Lakes, but never seen
the
ocean. And we drove along the Gulf Coast, which I always thought was really beautiful.
So then, so you came back, and Dad was still in school, and did you kept working then for a while? Mm-hmm. And so, what happened when he graduated from college?
He graduated in February of 1950, and then he before he graduated, well, he'd worked on and off for the newspapers.
Which newspapers?
The Urbana Courier, the Evening Courier, and some for the Champaign News Gazette. So he was approached by the News Gazette and asked to cover the campus for him. And they had a campus office with probably 2 reporters in there, and they just wrote about the university. And so he took that job, which fed us, for a while, and then all the time he was looking for jobs elsewhere. So he finally then just by writing letters and calling people and hearing about, jobs through other people.
And when you say elsewhere, were you and he targeting someplace?
Well,
or?
he wanted to go more west than east. I think that he wasn't interested in the East Coast or much in the South. So he was writing places like Denver, Albuquerque, places like that. And then he wrote to Amarillo, and the editor there was a graduate of the University of Illinois, and so he was interested in him as a graduate of the University of Illinois. So he got a sports job there in Amarillo.
And what now? He originally was a sports job, because I remember when I was born, he was the city editor.
Well, he was, but he went there as a sports writer, and then they reorganized, and he was I'd forgotten about that, but yeah, he was city editor there.
I know that because my birth announcement was on page 1. That's what happens when you're the city editor's kid.
That's a good way to make page 1.
So, what's your favorite memory of Dad?
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. We were talking about when Lisa was born, and he was so shocked, since we had 2 boys, and he'd come from a family of 3 boys. And we just assumed, we had a boy's name selected and everything. We just assumed it'd be another boy.
James Richard was the name.
And
I remember.
Big brother.
Well, yeah, because Jeff and I would play catch. We'd be talking about, we were going to call him Jamie. He was going to be Jamie, and we were going to play,
But he came out. He had seen you, came back into my room, and he said, "That's the meanest looking little girl I ever saw." And he did love having a little girl. He would, she, always had short hair and wore bib overalls. One time he brought her home and he said, "I wish you'd put her in something and make her look like a girl," because he'd been to the service station and they thought she was a boy, and he was embarrassed because
I wasn't embarrassed.
No, I'm sure you weren't, but he was.
So what other memories can you think of that are notable about Dad?
About Dad. He always had a smile on his face, almost always. And whenever, after his death, when people knew him, would ask me how I was doing, and I'd say, "Well, I'm just fine," but I don't laugh nearly as much as I did, when he was alive, which was true. But I think about things he said. He had his own vocabulary. And as you well know, and some of it was a little saltier than other parts, but he had a great deal of pride in his work and everything he did, and I can't think of anything, although I would get furious with him sometimes. I can't think of a bad thing to say about him.
What the vocabulary? What sort of things would you think of would be terms that he would use?
Well, I can't think of anything that's decent to say right offhand. His favorite thing was, "I don't give a rat's ass," I'd ask how he felt about something, and 9 times out of 10, that's what he'd say. But he taught me an awful lot. I mean, for, things about literature and about screenplays and stage plays and
Sports.
Sports, yes, sports. I didn't know anything about football until I met your dad, and I had to stay in conversations at the dinner table. I had to know about sports with 2 sons and Dick. So
I know about that.
yeah, I'm sure you do. You fit in.
And he got you to California.
He did, and he didn't really expect to come to California, but he didn't particularly want to. But then it was an opportunity, and he was always glad that we made the move. It was Bob Freitas, your godfather, who got us to California. He knew about the opening here and set it up.
Anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to? Or
Oh,
anything?
probably lots, but we can do it at home, sometime.
Anything you'd like to leave on the tape as words of wisdom for the Library of Congress or the people of America?
I will say one thing, that we always liked each other. In the family, when I was growing up, we always had a good time together, and we always, liked each other. And I think in our family, as you all were growing up, we did the same thing. Other than that, that's about it.
Okay,
I
thank
would
you.
advise everybody to like each other.
It'd be a lot better world if we could.